I started doing this series, the Ifs of Jesus, back in December. The first week, we were in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. If the salt loses its flavor, it's the first if in the New Testament anyway. But the idea behind it was a message about revelation, receiving revelation, and being restored restoration. That was what was behind it. Not so much the threat if the salt loses its flavor, but the answer to the question, how shall it regain it? So we did that. Week 2, we went to the last if, which is at the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus says to Peter, basically, if I will that John hangs around forever, what business is that of yours? And we saw that in the light of spiritual maturity, that it's a really good little verse to look at in terms of, so what does spiritual development look like? How do you know when you're spiritually mature? And it's basically when you're able to go into the garden and say, not my will, but your will. There's an element of spiritual maturity that takes place when he says to Peter, there'll come a time where it's not going to be about what you want. People are going to lead you in directions, and you'll be spiritually mature and you'll make it, this kind of thing. So we were about spiritual maturity. Week 3, we went to Mark 9, where Jesus delivers a boy who's being held captive by a demon, basically. And the father is looking for Jesus to do something and recognizes where he's at in his faith and everything. And Jesus encourages him that if you can believe, all things are possible. And so we spent that week looking at faith in him, many and all things. And then the last time we were together, we were in Luke 11, where we took the better part of Luke in the beginning there, not just one verse, but looked at prayer and, sonship, the fatherhood of God in their lives, and if a son asks for bread. It's going to take me a while to get to the bottom line. When I say a while, I don't mean in terms of time, like an hour from now, but I want to throw some things out to get to the point where we get to our if for today, so to speak. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but the Gospel of John, there's like 21 chapters. From chapter 7 to chapter 21, which is 2/3 of the book, takes place over 6 months. A lot of times we're looking at the Gospels and we're looking at these different things. We take a verse here, a story there, and so we kind of lose the continuity of time. But John, from chapter 7 to the very end in John 21, is only 6 months. Wow. 2/3 of his gospel. He's really zeroing in on the last 6 months before Jesus returns to his Father. In chapter 7, do you remember, it's the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus stands up on the biggest day with all the trumpets blowing and all that kind of stuff, and he stands up while they're enjoying this wonderful celebration and screams his brains out and says, if anyone is thirsty, come to me. You guys remember that? You may or may not remember, but that's the Feast of Tabs in John 7, where Jesus is talking about pouring out the Spirit. And John makes sure we don't miss it when he says, out of your innermost being shall flow rivers of living water. And then John parenthetically says he was talking about the Spirit. We were clueless, but that's what he was talking about, was the Spirit. And then we realized that, after the resurrection kind of thing. It's a week-long thing, and this is like the peak of it when Jesus kind of disrupts their celebration and says, that's all really good symbolically, but all it was a representation of me when I come and pour out my Spirit, and here I am. So if you're really thirsty, let's forget, the pouring out the water into the pool over there, and let's come to me. If you come to me, I will give you living waters, and out of your innermost being will flow these rivers of... And John tells us it was about the Spirit. The next day, and I'm just trying to add some continuity to this, what's going on. The next day is John 8, where they bring the woman to him, and, he who was without sin cast the first stone, that whole thing. That scene is in John 8. It's the next day. I'm saying this because we tend to get this... We're thinking, I love that story. Well, that was that was the next day after he really got a bunch of people seriously upset in John 7. This was the next day, and here we are in John 8. They bring the woman to him, and they would prefer that he stone her. So this is a bunch of guys that are very legally minded, and Jesus just kind of puts the law aside in a certain respect and responds in an entirely different way. And that leads them into a conversation. And if you're familiar with John 8, a conversation takes place about freedom and sonship. By the time we end the chapter, Jesus is saying to them, before Abraham was, I am. And so they pick up stones with the intention of stoning him. He makes his way from them, and then we get into John 9. It's a continual story. We get into John 9, and here's the blind guy. And the whole 9th chapter is taking place in this event of Jesus healing the blind guy. Makes his way to the pool of Siloam and wipes the mud off his eyes and all that. So that's in John 9. And that leads us into John 10. This is all taking place within a couple of days. Leads us into John 10, where Jesus identifies himself as the Good Shepherd. Talks about laying down his life for the sheep. And by the time we get to the middle of John 10, where we're going to be today, there's a lot of controversy about Jesus. We won't read it, but in verses 19 through 21, it says a lot of people are like, wow, this has got to be Messiah. And then there's a bunch of other people that say, but this can't be. So there's this division between two kind of people groups. There's going to be things I'm going to ask you to carry with you as we make our way through the next 30 minutes. When they bring that woman to Jesus, it says point blank in the 5th verse, they feel that she should be stoned. But they turn to Jesus and say, what do you say? And they think they've got him because it's a clear-cut case. By the end of the chapter, like I said, by the time that chapter ends, they're picking up stones to stone him. These guys are intent on seeing Jesus themselves actually being the ones who stone him. I want to hold this thought. We can always find stones when you're drinking from the wrong fountain. Jesus says, come to me, drink from this fountain, and out of you will flow the Spirit of God. If you're not, it's very easy in any situation to reach down and grab a stone. It's the natural thing to do if you're not drinking from the right fountain. Just hold that thought with me as we work our way through. So John 10 is 2 to 3 months later, when we get to verse 22, is the Feast of Dedication, which is not one of the ones that God gave them, it's one that they developed. And it's a good feast. It's a celebration of the fact that at one point the Syrian invasion took place and they defiled the temple and all that, and then the Maccabee boys, like in 164 BC, dealt with the situation, cleansed the temple, all that kind of stuff. So it's a really good celebration. This is the only place it's mentioned. And the way the story opens, Jesus is walking. John specifically tells us that Jesus is walking in Soloman's porch, which you may or may not know about. Solomon's porch was the area where leaders would gather. And they would either try cases, they would either judge situations, or they would just offer godly counsel to people, which is a different kind of judgment, godly counsel. And this is what happened in Solomon's porch. So we take both of those things together as we start to get into our thing here in verse 24. Jesus is walking in a place of judgment in Solomon's porch. He's also there at the time of Feast of Dedication, where he knows that Solomon's temple, everything the Jews have had from beginning to that point was all a representation that he was going to fulfill. He's looking at this temple, and he knows that this is the temple of God right here. And that the cleansing that they did in the temple over here made of stone, he's going to do a cleansing here. And the water that they were pouring out at the Feast of Tabs, he's going to be pouring out water and give us the water that we pour out of your innermost being. Not into, out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water. So I picture Jesus walking around Solomon's porch, looking at so much and going through so much. And then we get to verse 24. If somebody wants to read verse 24.
Then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, "How long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly."
Solomon's porch, I don't know exactly what it looked like, but it was an area where a lot of people could gather. These guys surround him. It says literally they surround him. And they say, don't keep us in doubt anymore. If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Just tell us. Initially, I don't think it sounds that bad. They wanted to know. Tell us. So the question has to be asked, well, are they sincere or not? John is kind of like a mystical book. I don't know if I say that a lot, but I want you to really, it is a bit of a mystical book. John, the Gospel of John, there's like these little things that John does that normally you just don't pick up on. For John, when he says the Jews, it's a code word for him. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. In like Matthew, the Jews, that term, the Jews, is used like 5 or 6 times. In Mark, it's used 5 or 6 times. In Luke, I think it's used like 3 times, something like that. You get to the Gospel of John, it's used 66 times. John's the last gospel being written, and John is saying something. In fact, a lot of people feel that John's use of the words, the Jews, have not been helpful to the way Christians and Jews have fought each other for 2,000 years because of the emphasis that John places on the Jews. They don't understand the emphasis that John was placing, and it sounds like he's just having a problem with Jews, if you see what I'm saying. But he's not. He's saying something. He's talking about a spirit. In John, the 1st chapter, verse 19.
This was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders sent priests and temple assistants from Jerusalem to ask John, "Who are you?"
Who went out to ask him who he was? Yeah, so that translation is changing it. It's the same words throughout. It's just the Jews. It says the Jews. Now that's saying the Jewish leaders, which I could gravitate towards that and say the Jews are the Jewish leaders. But if, as you read through the entire gospel, you realize it's not the Jewish leaders. It's a certain segment of the Jews that weren't going to embrace what Jesus was doing. Chapter 20, verse 19.
On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you."
Yeah, so here we are. This is the upper room, the Easter thing, and they're up there. What are they afraid of? The Jews. Well, who the heck are these Jews? These are their brothers, aren't they? I mean, these guys are all Jewish, but John is saying, John was there. We were afraid of the Jews. Jewish leaders, yeah, but not just Jewish leaders. The Jews.